Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. It's Friday, December 9th. It's, in fact, World Cup Day. And for those of you who are joining, keep an eye on that other screen that's going on, where Croatia and Brazil are starting their second half. That, too, is international politics of a different order. But we'll come back to that once the World Cup is truly done. In the meantime, lots of things to talk about, starting with the big news out of China. Zero COVID apparently doesn't apply anymore to China. COVID is over, or at least it doesn't seem to be a problem anymore for China. It's opening up from one day to the next, and we'll see what the implications are and why this is happening. Then we'll take a look at Xi Jinping's visit to Saudi Arabia and to the Gulf for meetings with Saudi royalty, with the Arabs and the Gulf states, and whether this is heralding a new era in China's engagement with the Gulf. And finally, a look at Israel's new government and its implications for the region. Here to talk about all of this today are Peter Spiegel, U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. Peter, great to see you.
Ivo, good to be back. Thank you very much.
Kim Ghattas is the contributing writer for The Atlantic, and she's joining us from Beirut, Lebanon. As always, Kim, great to see you again.
Great to be here, Ivo.
And Bobby Ghosh, an editor at Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, great to have you back. Bobby's joining us from New York City. And Peter, let's start with you. Zero COVID, it's ended. The thing that Xi Jinping has lauded as keeping China ahead of all countries, and particularly in the United States, apparently isn't necessary anymore. Why did they change the policy, and why did they do it now?
Well, I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, as you say, it was so tied to his prestige and legitimacy, this idea that they were the ones who could control COVID through the zero COVID policy. I mean, look, there's one reason only. For the first time, basically since Tiananmen, we had nationwide protests breaking out in multiple cities. Now, we've had small regional protests that have come up on, labor rights and things like this, but the fact that it was one issue that was unifying urban centers throughout China really did actually begin to threaten, to some extent anyway, legitimacy of the Communist Party. And I think they just looked at the writing on the wall and said, you know what, we're going to take an entire 180. And the extent of the 180 is actually, frankly, shocking. And having talked recently to some of our reporters in Shanghai and elsewhere, they are taking down testing booths. They are completely opening up. And the other interesting thing, which we talked about just before we went on air, is the propaganda machine is now in full mode blast about, the reason we've done this is purely science-based. Omicron is no longer as risky as it used to be, and the fact that he'd been forced to ramp up that propaganda machine tells me how concerned they are about legitimacy. Right? If they weren't worried about it, they wouldn't be going in full blast on that. The thing to watch for, I think, I just wrote down 2 or 3 things to keep an eye on for. I mean, part of the concern you started to hear from health officials is, China could suddenly see an actual surge in cases. And what we've seen as part of this propaganda effort is the number of cases are clearly not being reported. I think we're down to 14,000 reported cases in the last 24 hours, down from 40,000. There's no way they're going down, which means they're just not reporting them. So there is probably a secret surge in cases going on right now that global health authorities aren't aware of. And I think that's worth watching. The other thing is because of zero COVID policy, the Chinese have not been particularly good in their vaccine policy. They have 2 companies, Sinovac and Sinopharm, that have their vaccines themselves are not particularly effective. They're not mRNA vaccines. They're more their old traditional inactive virus vaccines. They have at best 50 to 60% efficacy, but most Chinese people, particularly elderly, have not been boosted. I think there's a recent data that shows about a third of those over 60 in China have been boosted. So there's a huge, we're talking, tens of millions of people who are in vulnerable age groups who have not been boosted. So I think, they made the decision for political reasons, but I think there is a growing concern amongst the global health community that this could be a return to a really troubling public health emergency within China. Look, I think it's fascinating. The problem we're all having, I think, as news organizations, is we're all struggling to get people in the country and to report on what is actually happening on the ground. We're being forced to rely on social media, and other ways, videos from various regions, which is being really shut down by the Chinese authorities. The social media things that we've seen that have gotten through, particularly in the pre-U-turn era, were truly, in my mind, shocking. Students in the streets talking about freedom, talking about an evil regime that is restricting their right to speak and right to get information. Again, rhetoric that we last heard in China back in the Tiananmen days. So I think what is telling here is the rapidity and the completeness of the U-turn, and the need to really pump up the propaganda machine. And that, to me, says they are concerned about the backlash. They're concerned about perceived legitimacy, because Xi himself had made it so personal and about his own personal prestige that zero COVID was the way forward, that he had mastered this pandemic in the way the West hadn't. And the fact he's been forced to reverse so completely, I think they're worried.
Yeah, and Kim, it strikes me, just to add to what Peter has said, that of course the policy gets announced when she's not in the country, and they're not saying that he is the one who drove the change in policy, because that's how they would characterize it. And then there's this problem that they face, as Peter says, the science isn't that this virus is less lethal. It's that when it's around places where there are lots of vaccinations and people have had COVID before, it is less lethal. Well, those are the two things that don't exist in China. This is a society that probably is as vulnerable to the virus as the United States was in April, May of 2020. When you think about the virulence, now a little less because there's some vaccination, but how are they going to sustain this argument that if in fact you do already have a surge, and the hospitals get overtaken, and the kinds of pictures we remember from what happened in Britain and Europe and the United States and other places, how are they going to manage this?
With quite some difficulty, I would assume, because as Peter said, it is an indirect admission of failure, although they'll never say it like that. And it is a 180, as Peter said, which came under pressure from, the street. And they're putting it in terms of scientific developments. There are sudden new conclusions about Omicron. And so they're explaining it away in a untruthful manner. And I think now the challenge comes, how do they manage the consequences of what they might suddenly be unleashing? I suspect that we're not going to get all the facts out of China if the virus is ripping through elderly populations, if the hospitals are going to be overwhelmed. We'll get some, because as we saw with the coverage of the protests, it's becoming difficult even for the Chinese to keep these things under wraps. It gets out and we hear about it, and the social media does go viral, and people do manage to connect with the outside world. But I suspect that in rural areas, in places outside of the big cities, you will possibly see high number of cases, possibly a high number of deaths, unfortunately. And the Chinese will try to obfuscate as much as possible, and they'll spin it in such a way. They'll put out something else out there. They'll focus on the improved economy. They'll focus on the next big development that they have within the country. But I think what this moment has shown us is the weakness in autocracies, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran. This comes at a very interesting moment for these autocracies that are trying to keep the lid on things. In China, at least, you could argue that it comes with great economic prosperity, but you can't smother and keep the population under control with regulations and controls that are inherently contradictory to human progress and life. And so I think that's this inflection point that the Chinese are finding now. And I think Xi Jinping is going to have a difficult time navigating that going forward.
Ivo, if I can just follow up on Kim's point on this, because I think it's an important one you asked the question sort of, how are they going to deal with this? Now, how they're going to have to deal with this is they're going to have to ramp up their vaccine program. And it's a big country with a very limited public health infrastructure. And I think to Kim's point about the legitimacy is there was a window of opportunity here. I mean, during the zero COVID period, what they could have done, even with their slightly less effective Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines, they could have actually launched a vaccine campaign. But they failed to do that. And I think one of the things that potentially could happen, as Kim pointed out, was this is the weakness of autocracies. If they had taken the opportunity to do it, they may have been able to get ahead of this. The fact that they didn't is going to, at some point, call into question their ability to manage the pandemic in a proper way. And I think this also is something that they run a real risk at if there is a sudden, as Kim put it, ripping through cities. I think that's a real risk to them as well.
Yeah, and I don't think their healthcare system generally is prepared for what might be coming. And sometimes I wonder whether they're deluding themselves, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, they're certainly deluding themselves. They think that people will simply, that their own people will simply buy into all this propaganda. If anything, we've learned from those protests that spin doesn't really work. People who are exposed to spin all the time, spin loses its effectiveness if that's all you have to offer. And Chinese people, I don't think, they're smart enough to know when they're being, what's the right word, gaslighted. It's interesting to me, a couple of things that are interesting to me. One is that now that the propaganda machine is sort of turning the other way, what I'm not seeing or not yet seeing is any messaging to prepare the population for likely breakouts of Omicron or whatever variant it is. There's nothing to suggest that people are being prepared, that, look, we're opening up. The science tells us we should open up, but the science also tells us that there will be a spike. Be ready for the spike. Don't let it frighten you. There is none of that sort of heading it off at the pass kind of messaging.
In fact, the opposite, right? The opposite is happening, which they're trying to say it's coming down. Yeah.
So that's the government is putting itself in harm's way. It's sort of setting itself up effectively. And then when that happens, people are going to respond. People are going to be mad as hell. And this attempt to control the information, to the point both Peter and the point all of you have made, which is that, yes, they'll try to control the information. They'll try to hide. But the more you do that, the more you make yourself vulnerable, as particularly to Kim's point, you make yourself vulnerable to rumor, to misinformation, disinformation, particularly out in the countryside where people don't necessarily have, the best information available to them. So, there's a pretty good chance that Xi Jinping and his government are setting themselves up for a huge failure here. And failure that their propaganda machine will contribute to rather than be a solution for.
And we'll have trouble covering up, I think, because if the healthcare system is unprepared, if you have vulnerable populations that are not vaccinated, if the population in general has not been exposed enough to the virus, because you do build up some immunity, it could have some serious implications in terms of what we might be seeing next. And if I may sort of emphasize what Bobby just said, they're doing exactly the opposite almost of what they should be doing, because they are trying to justify this 180 by saying they're the wise ones reacting to new scientific evidence that Omicron is, has decreased its sort of potency, etc. Whereas that's just not how, that's just what the science is telling us. And so it's interesting that they didn't think of having the get out of jail card in there, the caveat of, well, we're doing it this way, but there might be, a caveat, and we want you to be prepared. It's going to be difficult.
I think the real problem, and we've talked about this before, is they were stuck in a catch-22. They couldn't continue the zero COVID policy, but they also couldn't open up, because both of them are going to have a problem on the legitimacy of the system, given that they didn't prepare. And if they had prepared like New Zealand or Taiwan by vaccinating the population and then letting it rip, yes, numbers of deaths go up. But compared to what it was before, but it is at least manageable. And it seems to me at this point they can't manage it except with one thing. They could, if they were willing to, open up and bring in mRNA vaccines. And if they, in a regimented way, which this system probably is as good as anything else, were to vaccinate their population over the next 1 to 2 months, they might be able to do it. But that also means that you'd have to rely on Western technology, and you're stuck in your own propaganda loop. And so I guess the real question, just to end it here and get your thoughts on, is there any way out from where we're looking at? Not only are they digging deeper, but is there any way out for the regime to maintain some sense of its legitimacy that's built on a false promise?
Well, Ivo, let me address this, because I just try to take a step way back. I mean, you started this show during the pandemic, and I must say this is a topic that has come up, time and again. And I just remember in the recess of my mind, the way we've talked about China's response. And I think if you remember in the early days, there was a lot of nervousness among sort of liberal democracies. Is actually, if you need a mass lockdown because of pandemic, boy, autocracies are good with that stuff. And there was a nervousness that this was going to strengthen the hand of the autocracies. And then it became clear that actually the flexibility and the sort of, ability of liberal capitalism to respond with vaccines were like, well, actually, maybe liberal democracies are better at responding to this. And it ebbs and flows and ebbs and flows. And we're now at a point where we think we have a handle on it and the autocracies don't. But to your point, if there's any kind of organization that can actually suddenly flip a switch and say, actually, we have to mRNA everyone, it is an autocracy. So I guess the caveat I'll just say is, I think our thinking about how COVID plays into Xi's hands, I've been wrong on this before, and I've been right on it before. I think we have to sort of acknowledge that it is very, very difficult to predict how Chinese society and how the regime responds to these kinds of things. So they've proven an ability to respond very quickly, and frankly, even have a flexibility that perhaps we didn't give them credit for earlier in the pandemic.
Yeah, I think
that's also worth looking at an example of another big country, not an autocracy, but certainly a government with authoritarian tendencies, which is India, and what happened there. COVID, use the term du jour, ripped through the country, killed huge numbers of people. The government tried to hide the numbers with middling success, and people forgave them. They went to an election and won a bigger majority, did Modi and the BJP, than they had before, despite the enormous toll, human toll as well as economic toll that COVID took on the population. China is it's not necessarily apples and oranges, but they are both fruit, and there may be some lessons there for Xi Jinping, if nothing else.
Well, I think it's wise, the last 2 points, to emphasize that we don't know. As Yogi, that great American philosopher Yogi Berra once said, prediction is hard, especially about the future. And when it comes to COVID and the way the Chinese have responded, that's in particularly the case. But it bears watching very closely, because I think, to Kim's initial point, these autocracies are under a deep amount of stress because of something primal, human beings not wanting to be conforming to the way a society wants them to conform if they feel that that's not happening in the way necessary. We see that in Iran. We did see it briefly in China, and we'll see how it all plays out. But let's move on, Bobby. We're sticking a little bit with China. Xi Jinping traveled to Saudi Arabia, got an emperor's welcome, I think is the way to put it. Certainly a bigger and better one than when Joe Biden came. No fist bump here, but lots of military and other paraphernalia. Are we seeing the beginning of a new relationship between the Saudis in particular and China at the expense of the United States, or how should we look at this? Are we putting too much of a competitive U.S.-China lens on this, on what is happening here, which is our want, because we always think that the entire world sort of surrounds it's all about us, the United States. When it comes to MBS, however, it's usually about MBS. But how do you see it?
Not all about us, Ivo.
Well, I'm just asking. I'm just here asking.
No, listen. This is certainly what the Saudis would like us to think. They'd like us to think that this is that they are they are signaling to us while they make a deal or try to make more deals with Xi Jinping. They are. What's the right word? Punishing us or putting us in our place by showing, hey, you're not the only game in town. You're not the only superpower. Here's this other important, powerful figure. They buy our oil. You don't, which is, by the way, you always put out a bigger and more plush red carpet for a buyer than you do for a seller. And they'd like us to think that, well, if you don't do what we want, you don't give us the security guarantees we want, we'll get it for this guy. That's where they're completely wrong. That guy's got no interest in providing those security guarantees. Perfectly happy to sell them some Chinese-made arms. He would be perfectly happy to, as he did during COVID, since we were talking about that in the previous segment, he'd be perfectly happy to let the UAE produce Sinopharm vaccines, whatever they're, to the degree that they are worth anything. But beyond that, he's not making any commitments to protect them against Iran. He's got, his own interests to pursue there. He's not promising to protect the sea lanes. He's not giving them any help with the Houthis. There's not a lot of great intelligence sharing that takes place that is particularly worthwhile for the Gulf Arab states anyway. He's going there because he wants to buy oil. He wants to secure his oil deals. He wants to keep his sellers happy. But beyond that, I don't think that there's a great deal else Xi Jinping sees in the Middle East that would interest him. The Great Belt and Road Initiative is sort of gone off the rails a little bit. COVID was a big reason for that. The slowing Chinese economy is a big reason for that. I hate to say it, but basically he's gone there because that's where the oil is and not for very much else.
Bobby, can I ask Ivo's question in a slightly different way, just to be American obsessed by this? Because last time I was on was shortly after the Saudis basically led OPEC to spike or cut production just ahead of the midterms. And we had a debate here whether this was overtly inserting themselves into the American political process. Yeah. And I thought yes, and my other fellow panelists said no. But I really do think that this is part of a new Saudi Arabia, MBS in particular, that seems to be much more willing to overtly go and insert themselves into American politics. Look, this is the most anti-Saudi U.S. government that we've had, frankly, in the post-war era. I mean, Biden had almost completely cut off diplomatic relations with MBS because of Khashoggi incident, which had followed quite possibly the most pro-Saudi government that we've ever had in Donald Trump. And
rhetorically the most pro-Saudi government. In actual fact, not so sure.
Well, if you look at the Jared Kushner, MBS relationship, and there clearly was some, and the Saudis gave Kushner's private equity fund $2 billion shortly after they left office. I am seeing here an effort, and again, you can disagree with me because everyone else seems to disagree with me on this one. I see an effort by the Saudis to, as you say, punish the Biden administration because they would like to see Trump come back, and it bothers me that we haven't done more reporting on that. As all of our news organizations, about that residual relationship between the Trump family and the Saudi royal family, because there's clearly, to me, something still happening there that I think we haven't uncovered.
Well, of course, the crucial thing there is the three letters MBS. There's MBS completely dominates the political landscape there. This is MBS's initiative. If anybody wants to send Biden a message, it's MBS, and it's a response to Biden promising that he would make a pariah out of MBS. A very, very stupid thing for Biden to have said. There's a lot of anxiety in Saudi governing circles, and I have, over years cultivated contacts there, as I'm sure you have, and Kim certainly knows lots of people there. There's a lot of anxiety among senior Saudis who are worried at this direction that the Crown Prince has taken them, and it's not a country where you can openly criticize. We've seen what happens to people who do, but there is a lot of anxiety now. The relationship with the Kushners, with the Trump family, the Saudis have relationships like that with ruling families all over the world. So there is a, shall we say, institutional acceptance and understanding of the value of having those relationships. But there is a lot of anxiety about putting all their chips in that one basket. And the midterm results, particularly the humiliation that Donald Trump suffered because so many of his candidates were badly hammered. And the conversation growing around Ron DeSantis makes these Saudis, behind the scenes, quite nervous. They agree that, Saudi Arabia should pursue a somewhat more independent foreign policy than they have done before. They agree that courting Xi Jinping is a good idea, making nice with Narendra Modi is a good idea. These are two, India and China, big countries that buy a lot of oil. And nobody can disagree with MBS's general idea that Saudi Arabia should really diversify. He's basically following in the footsteps of King Abdullah before him, diversify away from dependence on oil. So these are general areas where they have consensus. But when it comes to foreign policy and this sort of pulling away almost and poking a finger in the eye of the United States as they pull away, that's not a consensus within the Saudi ruling elite by any means. And Kim, you'll know more about this because you have even better context there than I do.
Kim, yes, jump in here because you do know the Saudis and the Gulf and sort of how are they looking at this?
I concur with most of what Bobby said. I think, Peter, that the decision to cut the production was it November? Was
just for the midterms, yeah.
What was it? Was a bit of both. It was a little bit of poking the eye, but also a calculation by the Saudi oil minister that this was what needed to be done for their own national and economic interest. And I have to say they've been proven right. So
prices are down, yeah.
Prices are down, and production has remained stable at the last OPEC meeting. So, and that sort of, vindicates the Saudis to some extent. They can say, look, we told you. My understanding is that the relationship is rallying between, the two sides, between the US and Saudi Arabia, that it's stabilized, that there's better dialogue. Even with the freeing of Brittany Griner just now, they seem to have played some role. They want to hedge their bets because they are worried, and it's a little bit like a petulant child who wants more attention from its parents, and so it goes and runs to someone else in the hope that it will attract more attention. And so you see a little bit of that behavior with the Saudis. They slam the door, they walk out, they poke your eyes. But at the end of the day, with the Chinese, it is a very transactional relationship. It suits MBS's Vision 2030 for his economic vision for the country to have China as a partner. But I don't think that he sees China as a protector of any sorts or a political ally, except on, more sort of oppressive policies and autocratic tendencies. But Bobby's absolutely right. The Chinese are not going to protect the Saudis from future Iranian attacks, potential Iranian attacks. They're not going to find a way forward, although they might, the United States hasn't either, when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or furthering of the Abraham Accords. So I often find that the Chinese state visits or visits to the Middle East come accompanied with big headlines, but I find that mostly there's no real there, and China's not about to replace the United States.
One last thing on this, because I think it would help feed into the next conversation. I am just struck by the U.S.'s two most important allies in the region, right? Saudi Arabia and Israel. Both countries that for decades worked very hard to make sure that support on Capitol Hill was bipartisan, right? They did not insert themselves really in any real way in the partisan discussion in the election process. Both now are countries that are overtly, I think, inserting themselves with the finger on the Republican side. I mean, Netanyahu was pro Mitt Romney, was pro Donald Trump. He has, I think, risked American support for Israel on the Democratic side, the bipartisan support. And I think the Saudis are making the same mistake, which is they seem to be engaging in partisanship. And as Bobby said, there is nervousness within the Saudi establishment about this. But I think MBS himself and Benjamin Netanyahu himself, oddly strange bedfellows, have both made a calculation that their interest lies with the Republican Party.
And yet,
And I think that's a dangerous thing for both countries, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and yet, aside from how problematic it is to insert yourself into the domestic politics of the United States and bet on one party versus the other, as Bobby points out, during the Trump administration, the Saudis did come under attack. in September 2019, oil facilities were attacked and the Americans were nowhere to be seen. So, we should also be reminding the Saudis that they shouldn't put all their eggs in one basket, because, Trump did not deliver for them. And there is, in the actual Republican Party itself, not in the Trump family, in the Republican Party, there isn't a lot of love for the Saudis either. So they really have to be careful. And I think
very personal. Sorry, go ahead, Kim.
I think that the results of the midterm elections are a sobering moment. I mean, I hear how some Saudis speak of American officials or even of the president, and it's really, it's embarrassing for them. And I think they thought they could dismiss this aging president who mumbles and fumbles sometimes in public. They have these weird conspiracy theories about who is really running the show at the White House. And I think now they've woken up to the fact that actually this administration is really doing quite well. It just doesn't trumpet it as well as it should or could. They've had some, failures, Afghanistan being the biggest one. But overall, they underpromise and overdeliver, and they've done quite well on so many levels. And I think that is a sobering moment for the Saudis. And just one last thing I would say about the difference in the welcome between Xi Jinping and Biden. To be honest, I don't think the Americans would have wanted this kind of big carpet, royal, princely welcome. They wanted to keep it a little bit low key. It's too bad about the fist bump, but I don't think President Biden would have wanted the kind of welcome that Xi Jinping got today.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that this is all very, very personal. The relationship between, unlike, this is where Netanyahu and MBS are different. Netanyahu's relationships with the Republican Party are both personal, individual one-on-one with Republican leadership, but with a wide range of Republican leaders, and also institutional with Republican institutions, as well as pro-Republican Jewish institutions in this country. With MBS in Saudi Arabia, it's very, very individual. Saudi relations with individual Democratic senators and congressmen, for instance, those really haven't changed very much. It's just as the relationship with the Trump family is all about Donald Trump and to some degree Kushner, the negative relationship that we see right now is all about Biden. Another Democratic candidate turns up next time and wins the nomination from the Democratic side, or Biden decides not to run, poof, it's all gone. It's instructive to see what happened when MBS and MBZ decided that Qatar was the bad guy, and they launched that embargo on Qatar. There was an enormous amount of propaganda about how evil Qatar was, and the royal family was the epitome of all evil. Sheikh Tamim was the worst thing since Satan. Now the embargo's over, and as I said, poof, Tamim and MBS are hugging it out. They were hugging it out in Qatar. They're now hugging it out in Riyadh. It's as if all of that antagonism, all of that bitterness has just gone out the window. And you know what? Pretty good chance you'll see that happen with the Democratic Party if a different candidate from Biden steps up. If it's still Biden, well, then all bets are off.
Well, we'll have to see what happens to this famous.
Can I say one last thing on the subject of Saudi Arabia and its efforts to engage with countries like China? I think what the Saudis would like to project is that they are a middle power in the region that is asserting its leadership of the Arab and Muslim world and should be treated as an equal partner of the US, and that it can deliver for the US. I think that's some of what, I'm not saying they're successful, but they feel like they should be treated like a country that can deliver more than just oil. And so they like to tout the fact that actually we have connections and a conversation with the Russians, and we can help you, mediate or negotiate certain things. So I think that's also part of their approach to the sort of hedging of the bets and the opening up to various other players in the world.
Yeah, in some ways, and it's unfair, but I'm going to say it anyway. They remind me of France, which is a country that is trying to, for a good reason, because it is a powerful player in a region, wants to be respected and believes in, as de Gaulle said, la grandeur. In order to make clear who they are. They also remind me of Turkey, which we were talking about before we went on the air. These are these middle powers who in many ways want to be respected. If you play it right, it's pretty easy to respect them, but they also chafe at their dependence, because in the end, that what's really behind them is they know deep down that without the United States, they can't go anywhere. And that relationship is not one of equals, and it never will be. In France's case, a little less, of course, than certainly with the Saudis, given that they are a major military power in their own right, and and including with nuclear weapons. So in that sense, it breaks down. But there is this sense of chafing at being the underdog. The other thing, and this is a good transition. At the time that the Trump administration was in power, there was this famous WhatsApp quartet. There were these four people who were constantly going back and forth: MBS, MBZ, Jared, and Bibi, on WhatsApp, talking to each other. And I think Bobby's larger point about Israel's deeper alignment, and including Likud and Netanyahu's deeper alignment with the American establishment is a good one, in distinction. But it's there, and Bibi is back. Kim, he won the election by full-throated embrace of whoever was further to the right than he was, which turns out is actually a quite substantial part of the Israeli electorate under the circumstances that we're living in. And he will have a new government in the next few days, and probably be able to govern for the next 4 years with a pretty substantial majority. Bring us up to date about what's happening in Israel, but then also the implication for the region. You wrote a wonderful piece about Lebanon and the difficulties it's facing in the Financial Times this week. Jordan it's still a extraordinarily important player and peace partner of the United States. Egypt, same thing. What is going to be the implication of the return of Bibi to Israel and to the immediate region?
Goodness, yes. Where to begin? It's quite incredible that we're looking at this comeback and the implications that it's having, not just for the Palestinians, not just for Israeli society, not just for relations with countries that Israel has made peace with in the past, or more recently with the Abraham Accords, but even to some extent, the interaction, if not the relationship, between Israel and the US. There was a report in Axios that said that there was a high-level meeting in the White House last week to discuss how to approach the potential new government that Bibi is forming, and the possibility of not engaging with some of the more ultra-nationalist ministers that it could include, like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, really as far right as you can imagine. Of course, these are the kinds of conversations that American officials or statements that American officials would have about, a Palestinian Authority or about a Lebanese cabinet, not about an Israeli government. Now, it's likely that he will be able to form this cabinet by Sunday. He has to form it by Sunday. Otherwise, he can ask for a 14-day extension. Bibi can ask for a 14-day extension. What it means is, because of his own political troubles, his legal troubles, the fact that he needs to be in power to avoid, further legal troubles and trial, the far right is able to squeeze him further and further into concessions, because they know he wants to form a government. He needs to form a government. And it's incredible to see that Israel's, politics, culture, but also society is in the hands of this one man. And you're seeing not just discussions about the implications, as I said, for the region and the US, etc., but also, some uproar within Israel, where there was a sense that the far right, it's all about the Palestinians, and, we're living safely as possible, and the Palestinians are conveniently behind a wall. But now suddenly people are realizing that the far right has implications for them too. I mean, if you listen to somebody like Avi Moaz from the Noam party, he's, opposes women serving in the Israeli army. He wants to cancel the gay pride in Tel Aviv. Those have these actions have consequences for Israeli society, and so that's why there's now a discussion about what this all means for Israeli democracy, and of course what it's going to mean for Palestinians, because some of these potential ministers have very, again, right-wing views on Palestinians. Some of them want to annex the West Bank. This is already the most violent year for Palestinians in the occupied territories since 2005. More than 150 Palestinians have been killed, as well as 26 Israelis. 2005 was the end of the second Intifada. And so there's a lot going on here, and it will have ramifications for the region, including for countries like the UAE, which is just a few years ago entered into the Abraham Accords. And you're already hearing voices in the UAE saying the Abraham Accords should be frozen because we cannot engage with this kind of Israeli government. It's a real inflection point for this region between the developments in Israel and the protests in Iran. Everybody's sort of hedging their bets and trying to figure out where the chips will fall.
I think, Kim, it's you who says usually you can leave the Middle East, but the Middle East is the basic rule. You can leave the Middle East, but the Middle East doesn't leave you. And
no.
I think we're just seeing that right now, particularly with what's the wider regional implications. Peter, sorry.
That was exactly the point I wanted to make or ask him about, which is her last point about the UAE and the Abraham Accords, because there was, because of the Iranian threat, a growing semblance that the Abraham Accords could be expanded, that there was this sort of détente, particularly with the real prize there, which is something with the Saudis. Is that now completely off the table? I mean, do you see? I mean, if this government comes in and, as you suggested, tries to annex or further cracks down on the Palestinians, I got to imagine that reduces the amount of flexibility that the Saudis have to engage in any expansion of the Abraham Accords. But also, I'm just curious about Iran specifically, because there is what we now know, sort of ex post facto, is that even under the previous Netanyahu regime, which was a more moderate government, the extent to which the U.S. had to try to clamp them down from a preemptive unilateral strike inside Iran on the nuclear program, boy, they really had to try hard to make sure that Netanyahu didn't do that. If you now have a much more nationalistic, Netanyahu government, what does that say about how Israel deals with Iran? So I'm just curious, Saudi-Israel relations and then Iranian-Israeli relations, if you could take a punt at both of those and what you think might happen there.
I think in private, the Saudi-Israel relationship might continue in terms of intelligence sharing and so on, which we've had, behind closed doors for many years already. I think any expansion of the Abraham Accords is going to be very difficult if you're going to see renewed violence in the Palestinian territories, or increased violence, because we already have violence. And certainly, if you see continued settler violence with the encouragement of members of the cabinet, I don't see the Saudis being able to present themselves as leaders of the Muslim world and custodians of the two holy sites while simultaneously engaging with the Israelis publicly. Are other Arab countries going to retreat from their accords, the Abraham Accords? We'll have to see. I think they would prefer not to, but if you remember during the second Intifada, there were ambassadors. There were at the time trade relations between some countries, Oman, I think Bahrain, and they had to recall diplomats and close embassies, etc. So depending on how far the actions of the far right ministers go and how they push the army and settlers into certain actions, I think then each Arab country will, or Arab countries will decide how to deal with that. As Tom Nides said, the ambassador to Israel, the US ambassador to Israel said, we're going to work with Prime Minister Bibi and we're going to deal with the government according to its policies, not individuals. So, people are reserving judgment. When it comes to Iran, my guess, but I'm just thinking out loud here, I think that the Israelis will be very worried about nuclear capabilities advancing quite rapidly because there's absolutely no control anymore at the moment. But they'll also be watching the protests to see how that unfolds, because that is also a moment of opportunity for a different future for Iran. Messy in the short term and the medium term, probably. But you could end up with a slightly more flexible regime at the top that will need to focus on its domestic politics and its national interests and not be so revolutionary and willing and eager to export revolutionary ideology. But it would be a mistake for the Israelis to preempt anything by ordering a military strike, because then you would see a rallying of the people, I think, around the Iranian leadership. That's just how it works.
And by the way, I don't think the Emiratis want the Israelis to conduct a preemptory strike either. From what I gather, they were pushing very hard, just as much as the US was at Netanyahu, to prevent that from happening the last time around. They want a united front against Iran, but they're very acutely aware that if Iran were to retaliate, that their cities, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and so forth, would be at the front line. It's not a comfortable prospect. I think Kim is exactly right there. The thing that on the Palestinians, I think anything short of a third intifada, the Arab states of the Abraham Accords would be able to tolerate and swallow, and in their sort of balance, the calculus that they make, that would be they would be okay with a certain level of violence. They would tolerate a certain level of violence, but if it became a widespread intifada, like every town in the West Bank is up in arms and the Israeli military is going in, not just in
or annexation.
Yeah, that they wouldn't tolerate, I think.
Annexation.
And annexation. And the other thing that Bibi has in his favor is the Palestinian Authority has no real legitimacy, not just among the Palestinian people, but also in all these regional capitals. I mean, people are tired of hearing the same leaders say the same old things. So that also sort of serves Bibi's purpose a little bit. On the Iranian question, I think, we'll see a lot more heated rhetoric. This will suit the Iranian regime just fine, because they need a distraction from their current domestic problems, and being able to play the Israel hoodoo, that card again, is something that will suit them perfectly fine. I'm not so sure ordinary Iranians will buy that for very much longer. But certainly, we were talking about Chinese propaganda earlier, the Iranian propaganda machine, for them, this is catnip.
Well, it is a fascinating set of issues that we're watching here. The impact of the changes. I think the only other thing I would emphasize that might become a problem is not just the potential of escalating violence in the West Bank and among the Palestinians and with the Palestinians, but of course the possibility to return to violence among Israelis, Arab and Jews, which is also a deep division that is now further divided the society, given the government and some of the people running, about to run ministries responsible for security and police, etc. Something to watch, which we will. Can't think of any better people to watch it with than Kim Ghattas, Bobby Ghosh, and Peter Spiegel. I want to thank all three of you for really great insight. Thank all of you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. And until then, bon weekend.
Great to be with you.
Thanks, Ivo.
Bon weekend.
And we didn't miss any goals. So.